What is happening to your loved one's soul on the anniversary of their death? That's not a rhetorical question. And it's not easy comfort dressed up as spirituality. It's the question you've been carrying since the first time that date came back around on the calendar and found you not knowing what to do with it. Because something in you knows that day is different from every other, that it's more than memory, that something living is happening on the other side while you're standing here, in front of a photograph or a grave, or simply the silence of a house that has never felt quite the same. Saint Teresa of Jesus saw it. She was where we have never been. And what she wrote about that exact day in the life of a waiting soul is something no one has ever told you with this kind of clarity. There are people who have spent years wondering whether their departed loved one remembers them, whether that person knows someone has been praying for them, whether the day that weighs so heavily on the living carries any meaning from the other side of the veil. Saint Teresa of Jesus' answer is not the kind that simply soothes and sends you on your way. It's an answer that shakes you, that demands something of you, that makes you understand the bond between you and that person did not end with death. It changed form, that the anniversary is not yours alone, that on that day, something concrete and real happens to the soul of the one you loved, something that depends, at least in part, on what you do from this side. Before we go any further, leave a comment telling me how many years you've been carrying that date. Write the name of the one who left and how much time has passed. Do it, because that name deserves to be spoken aloud today. What you're about to hear was not available just anywhere. It was waiting for you to come looking for it. There is something the living take for granted without even realizing it. The way time works. A day has 24 hours. A year has 365 days. Dates come back around, stack up, become history. And within that familiar, almost automatic logic, the anniversary of a loved one's death is exactly that, a date that returns. A number on the calendar the heart recognizes before the eyes even see it. But Saint Teresa of Jesus understood something that most of the living never stop to consider. She understood that this logic of time, this deeply human way of measuring days and years, is not the only one that exists, and that the soul of the one who died no longer lives inside it. This is not abstract philosophy. It is the starting point of everything Saint Teresa of Jesus left written about the condition of souls that have crossed to the other side. In the interior castle, her most mature work, the one she wrote when her interior life had reached a depth she herself struggled to describe, Teresa writes about the soul that enters the interior dwelling places as a soul leaving behind the categories of the world. Time is one of them. Not because time ceases to exist, but because it ceases to function like a chain. The soul that has died does not live trapped in the succession of days the way we do. It sees things from a place where the past, the present, and what is yet to come relate to reality in a completely different way. And yet, something happens on the anniversary. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not explain this in the terms a modern theologian would use to build a thesis. She explained it the only way she ever explained things she had truly seen, through images, comparisons, and that direct honesty that makes her writing sound more like conversation than treatise. And what she described is this: certain dates retain a resonance in the soul even after death. The day a soul left the body and entered eternity does not vanish from its awareness as though it never happened. On the contrary, that moment carries a particular weight in the story of that soul, because it was the moment of its greatest transformation, the instant when everything changed irreversibly. And that instant, that threshold, resonates each time its anniversary arrives on earth. How can something resonate in a soul that no longer lives within time? That's the question anyone would ask. Teresa didn't avoid it. In The Way of Perfection, she wrote about how deep prayer brings the soul to a state where time is experienced differently, where a single moment can contain what would normally take hours, where the distance between the soul and God becomes the only measure that matters. If that happens to the soul of a living person in prayer, she wrote, how much more will it happen to the soul that has already crossed the threshold and dwells in the fullness of that other way of being? The communion of saints is not a decorative phrase in the creed. It is a living reality that Teresa took with a seriousness that sometimes astonished her confessors. She spoke of the saints and of the souls in waiting as people with whom she maintained an active relationship, not as pious figures one prays to from a distance. And within that understanding, the anniversary of a soul's death has a dimension that goes beyond human remembrance. It is not only that the living remember, there is something in the fabric of love that unites the living with the dead, and that something is activated in a particular way on that date. Think of it this way. When someone you love deeply is far away, there are days that both of you feel differently, even separated by thousands of miles. The day you met, the day something hard bound you together forever. Those days are not like the others, not for one, not for the other. Even though neither of you planned it that way, there is something in love that marks certain dates with an intensity that the simple passage of time does not erase. Teresa believed, and she wrote it, that this same reality operates between the living and the dead, that the love that existed did not disappear, that it acts, that it connects, and that on the dates that carry weight in that shared history, that connection becomes especially active. The anniversary of death carries the most weight of all, because it is the precise point where that soul's history changed forever, where what was one way ceased to be, where something began that is still unfolding. And if the love connecting you to that person is real, and Teresa was convinced that real love does not die with death, then that point holds a spiritual gravity that acts on both sides of the veil at the same time. But there is something Teresa saw specifically about the condition of the soul in that moment. Not vaguely, not as a general description of purgatory. Something concrete about what is happening to your loved one's soul when that day arrives. And what she saw moves well past easy comfort into something that asks you to be present in a way you may never have considered before. Because the soul in that moment is not asleep. The soul of the one who died is not in a deep sleep waiting for something to wake it. This is one of the most widespread misunderstandings among genuinely devout people. People who attend Mass, who pray the Rosary, who hold real faith, and yet carry an image of the afterlife that does not correspond to what the Church teaches or to what Saint Teresa of Jesus saw. The idea that the departed are in a kind of unconscious rest, unaware of everything, perceiving nothing, waiting passively for the final judgment the way a person sleeps without dreaming. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that image, and she corrected it with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. In the book of her life, the work where Saint Teresa of Ávila recorded her mystical experiences in the most detail, there are passages her confessors read with a mixture of astonishment and caution. Passages where she describes what she saw in souls that had crossed to the other side. What she describes is not inactivity, it is not absence. It is an awareness that we, trapped in the limits of the body and the senses, cannot easily imagine. A full, awake, lucid awareness, more lucid than anything we have ever experienced in this life. The soul that has died sees with a clarity that was impossible here. It feels with an intensity that was muffled here by everything the body, the ego, and the noise of daily life placed between the soul and reality. That changes everything. Because if the soul is awake, if it has full consciousness of where it is, what surrounds it, what still separates it from God, then the anniversary of its death does not pass unnoticed. It is not a date that exists only on the calendar of the living. It is a date the soul recognizes from its own place, with its own awareness, with the heightened clarity that comes from having crossed the threshold. Saint Teresa of Jesus described the state of souls in purification with an image that is hard to forget once you've heard it. She compared them to someone who knows the road ahead perfectly, who sees the destination with complete clarity, who understands without any confusion what still separates them from it, and who nonetheless cannot hasten the journey on their own. Not because they are asleep, not because they are confused, but because purification has its own pace, a pace that depends not only on the soul itself, but also on the grace it receives from outside, from the living who pray for it, from God's mercy, which acts through that prayer. The soul knows where it is. It knows how far it has come, and it knows how far it still has to go. Now you begin to understand why the anniversary carries such particular weight for that soul. Because on that day, the date that marked the beginning of its journey into eternity, the soul does something that Saint Teresa of Ávila described as a recognition. A moment in which the soul's awareness pauses, if that word even applies to where it exists, and contemplates the full arc of what it has traveled since it departed. Not with the anguish of someone unsure of arriving, with the clear-eyed vision of someone who can see the entire road and understands exactly where on it they stand. One of the things that surprised Teresa's confessors most was how she spoke about time from the perspective of the souls she had seen in her visions. She did not speak of them as beings cut off from the time of the living. She spoke of them as beings with a different but not disconnected perception of time. They know how long it has been since they died. They perceive the rhythm of the prayers offered for them. They notice the difference between a period when someone intercedes steadily and a period when silence settles in and no one says their name. This is what drove Saint Teresa of Ávila to insist with such urgency on prayer for the departed, not as one pious practice among many, as a concrete responsibility toward concrete people who are in a real place with a real consciousness, genuinely perceiving whether anyone on the side of the living is carrying them in their heart or has forgotten them. And on the anniversary of their death, that perception intensifies. The soul is not only awake. On that specific day, it is especially attuned to what is happening from this side, especially receptive, especially aware of the bonds that connect it to those left behind, because that day was the day those bonds were transformed forever. And something in the nature of love means that transformation is felt with renewed intensity each time the anniversary comes around. What exactly does the soul feel in that moment? Saint Teresa of Jesus was more precise than you might expect, and what she described begins with something very few people would have anticipated. The first thing that happens in your loved one's soul when the anniversary of their death arrives is not what most people imagine. It is not grief. It is not nostalgia in the way the living know it, that bittersweet mixture of memory and absence that aches in a way that has no exact name. What Saint Teresa of Jesus described as the soul's first movement in that moment is something we can only name in English with a word we tend to use superficially, without understanding its full weight. That word is recognition. The soul recognizes. And that recognition is not simply remembering, it is seeing, understanding, with a clarity that is not available to us here, trapped in the body and the constant noise of the world. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about how the soul that enters deep prayer begins to see its own spiritual situation with an honesty that is nearly impossible in ordinary life. The distractions, the fears, the ego, the excuses we construct to avoid looking too far inward, all of it interferes here with self-knowledge. But the soul that has died has none of that standing between itself and the truth. It sees with the same clarity with which it sees everything else from where it is. And what it sees on the anniversary of its death is its own journey from the very beginning. Saint Teresa of Ávila used an image in her writings that helps make this understandable. She wrote about souls that in her visions contemplated their past lives not with the distorted pain with which the living tend to review what we did or failed to do, but with a serene and complete understanding that held both the shadows and the graces. The soul sees everything. It sees the times it loved well and the times it loved badly. It sees the prayers it said from the heart and the ones it said out of habit. It sees the moments when God was very close and it did not know it, and the moments when it drew away and God followed anyway. And that complete vision, far from plunging the soul into despair, produces something unexpected. It produces gratitude, a gratitude of an intensity for which we have no adequate words here, because the soul sees, at the same time, that it sees everything it was and everything it did, the sheer magnitude of the mercy that held it up. It sees that it reached the threshold of eternity, that it crossed, that it is on its way to God, even if it hasn't arrived yet. And it understands, with the lucidity of one who no longer deceives itself about anything, that this was not something owed to it by right. It was grace, pure grace. Grace that came through the prayers of others, through the sacraments, through sufferings offered up, through acts of love done where no one could see. And on the anniversary of its death, when the soul contemplates the full arc of the first year, or the 5th, or the 10th of its journey in eternity, that gratitude renews itself with an intensity Saint Teresa of Jesus described as a flame that does not consume but illuminates. There is something else in that recognition that Saint Teresa of Ávila noted with particular care. The soul does not only see its own journey, it sees with precision the exact point where it stands. And this, far from being a source of anguish, works like a compass. The soul that knows where it is also knows what it needs. It knows what kind of grace would bring it closer to God in this particular moment of its purification. It knows which sufferings offered by the living would carry the most weight for its specific situation. And on the anniversary of its death, that awareness is especially active. Saint Teresa of Jesus spoke with her confessors about visions in which souls in purification appeared to her with a clarity about their own state that she described as striking. They did not come confused. They did not come uncertain of what to ask. They came with an exact awareness of what they needed and of whom they could ask. And what they asked for almost always took the same shape: a mass, a specific prayer, an act of charity offered with intention. Not as automatic rituals, but as conscious acts of love directed toward a real person in a real place waiting for a real grace. The person listening to this who has spent years wondering whether their prayers for a departed loved one ever reached anyone, this is Saint Teresa of Avila's answer to that question. They arrived. The soul heard them, it felt them. And on the anniversary of its death, the soul is especially prepared to receive them, with a receptivity that does not exist in the same way at any other point in the year. But there is something that happens in that moment beyond the soul receiving what the living offer. There is movement in the other direction, something the soul sends from where it is toward those who remember it, something Saint Teresa of Jesus described as the second great movement of the anniversary. And it completely changes the way you understand what you yourself feel on that day. There is something most of the living do not know they receive. They receive it every year when the anniversary of a loved one's death arrives. They receive it without identifying it, without putting a name to it, sometimes without even noticing it beneath the weight of the day. But it is there. It is real. And Saint Teresa of Jesus described it with a precision that none of her contemporaries expected to find in the writings of a Carmelite nun of the 16th century. The soul in purification is not a passive soul. This is one of the truths Saint Teresa of Ávila repeated in different ways throughout her entire body of work, especially in the book of her life, where she recorded in detail the experiences that led her to understand it. The soul in purgation is not locked inside itself, consumed only by its own process, cut off from everything happening outside it. It has a capacity for love that, purified of everything that limited it in life, operates with a freedom and an intensity we do not have access to here. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the book of her life, "True love, if it is love, must tend toward God or toward the one it loves, so that it does not remain sterile." What she was pointing to is that authentic love is not blocked by death. It is not interrupted. It does not freeze into a feeling locked at the moment of farewell. It keeps acting, it keeps moving. And when the soul has been purified of the selfishness and distortions that here accompany even the most genuine love, that love operates with a cleanness and a force the living can only partially imagine. Toward whom does that love turn on the anniversary of the death? Toward those the soul loved in life, toward those who grieve it, toward those who pray for it, toward those who on that specific day are remembering it, even in silence, even without knowing quite how to do it, even if their prayer is nothing more than the quiet internal whisper of a name they do not want to forget. The soul perceives them. Saint Teresa of Jesus was very clear about this. The soul in purification is aware of the living who intercede for it, and that awareness on the anniversary reaches an intensity that has no parallel at any other point in the year. And what it does with that perception is love. Love back with everything it has. A love no longer mixed with fear, with need, with dependence, or with any of the shadows that here get tangled into even the most beautiful bonds. A love that is pure in the most literal sense of the word, because it has been purified. A love that pours toward the living from the other side of the veil, with a force that some people feel without knowing where it comes from. Have you ever felt something unusual on the anniversaries of those you've lost? Not necessarily an apparition or a dramatic sign, something more subtle, a sense of company you can't explain, a peace that arrives in the least expected moment of a day you thought would be nothing but heart, an interior certainty without a clear origin that this person is not as far as the silence of their absence suggests. Saint Teresa of Jesus would say, "You are not imagining it." That what you perceive in those moments is real, even if it arrives in a way the body's senses are not equipped to capture precisely. The love of the soul in purification toward the living who remember it operates as intercession. The soul, from where it is, prays for those who pray for it. It brings the living before God with the same intensity with which the living bring it before God. And on the anniversary of its death, when that mutual awareness reaches its highest point of the entire year, that intercession carries special weight. The soul is praying for you on that day with a clarity and a force that at no other moment of the year has quite the same intensity. This turns the anniversary into something entirely different from what most people understand it to be. It is not only the day when the living remember the dead. It is the day when the living and the waiting soul meet with the greatest spiritual closeness possible on this side of eternity. A real point of contact between two dimensions of existence that love keeps joined despite death. And Saint Teresa of Ávila, who spent decades deepening her understanding of that reality through prayer and through the visions God granted her, was convinced that ignoring that encounter, letting it pass without preparation or intention, was to squander one of the most concrete graces God places within reach of those who love their departed. But there is one more dimension of what happens in the soul on that day, one that Saint Teresa of Jesus described with a particular urgency, one that has to do not with what the soul feels toward those who remember it, but with what it experiences when the anniversary arrives and silence reigns on the other side. There is a question Saint Teresa of Jesus asked with a frequency her biographers documented and that appears implicitly throughout several of her writings. It was not a question about her own salvation or about the great theological debates occupying the churchmen of her time. It was a far more concrete question, one much closer to the ordinary human ache of every day. How many souls are waiting right now without anyone praying for them? Saint Teresa of Ávila knew. She had seen it. In her visions, she had encountered souls in purification who had been waiting. For a length of time, the living would struggle to comprehend, without a single suffrages reaching them to ease that weight. Souls who had had families, who had been loved, who had left people behind when they died. But time moves on for the living too. The urgencies of daily life press in. The raw pain of loss, so intense in those first months, begins to yield to the life that continues. And without anyone consciously deciding it, the departed person's name appears less and less often in prayer. A mass is offered on the first anniversary, perhaps on the second, but eventually the date passes and no one marks it. And the waiting soul finds that on its anniversary, the day that for it carries the weight of a threshold, nothing arrives from the other side. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about this in the book of her Foundations with an urgency that went beyond the usual tone of her writing. She described the situation of forgotten souls not as an abstraction, but as a reality she had witnessed firsthand, one that moved her to intercession with an intensity she could not explain in terms of general piety alone. It was something more personal, more pressing, like someone who knows a person is trapped in a place they could leave if someone would just reach out a hand and watches that hand fail to come. Not out of cruelty, but simply because those who could extend it don't know it's needed. The soul in purification does not resent. This matters to say plainly, because the image of a departed person suffering from resentment toward the living who forgot them does not correspond to what the Catholic faith teaches or to what Saint Teresa of Ávila saw. The soul undergoing purification has lost the capacity for that kind of resentment, because part of what purification does is precisely to cleanse the soul of everything that is not love. The soul passing through that process grows increasingly to resemble the love that God is, and love does not hold grudges. But the soul does experience something when the anniversary of its death arrives, and nothing comes from the side of the living. What it experiences is not abandonment in the emotional sense we know. It is closer to what Saint Teresa of Jesus described when she wrote about spiritual dryness in prayer. Not the pain of someone rejected, the thirst of someone who knows water exists, that it is near, that they could receive it, and who in this moment simply does not. A thirst that does not destroy, but prolongs. That does not add new suffering, but extends what already exists longer than necessary. Because purification has a pace that can be hastened. Saint Teresa of Ávila knew this with certainty. She had seen it in her visions of souls that moved from purgatory to glory in periods that, without the intercession of the living, would have been far longer. She had lived it in her own experience as an intercessor when she prayed fervently for specific souls and received in prayer the interior certainty that something had shifted, that grace had acted, that the weight had been shortened. The prayer of the living is not a symbolic gesture. It is a real force acting on a real situation. When that force is not applied, the situation remains where it was. The anniversary of death is the moment in the year when that force can act with the greatest effect. Saint Teresa of Jesus taught this directly and lived it consistently. The soul's receptivity on that specific day is a receptivity that does not repeat with the same intensity at any other point in the year. What is offered on the anniversary arrives differently. It carries different weight, it produces a different effect. And when that day passes with nothing arriving, the opportunity is not lost forever. God closes no door with a permanent lock. But something has been left unused that will not come again until the following year. There are people listening to this who, in this moment, are thinking of someone. Someone whose anniversary may have passed recently without being marked in the way they now understand it could have been. Someone whose anniversary is coming up and who they can still reach with a new and deeper intention. Saint Teresa of Ávila did not teach these things to produce guilt. She taught them to produce love, a conscious, active love that understands the bond with the departed has not ended, and that has concrete tools for expressing itself from this side of the veil. But there is still something more that Saint Teresa of Jesus revealed about what can happen on the anniversary when prayer does arrive. Something about the specific grace that day makes available to anyone who seeks it with intention, and it changes the way you understand the act of praying for a departed loved one altogether. Not all prayers carry the same weight, not in the sense that God values some more than others based on who offers them or how eloquently they're worded, but in the sense that grace has its own rhythms, its own openings, its own moments of greater availability. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this from direct experience. She had lived through long stretches of dryness in prayer, arid effort with no sensible consolation, and periods when the same simple prayer seemed to open onto a depth that left her speechless. And she learned, with the patience of someone who builds a spiritual life brick by brick, that these differences were not accidental or arbitrary, that grace has moments of special availability that the attentive soul learns to recognize and use. The anniversary of a loved one's death is one of those moments, not the only one, but one with characteristics that make it singular among all the days of the year when it comes to prayer for that specific person. Saint Teresa of Ávila taught that the grace acting in favor of a soul in purification does not operate in a void indifferent to time. It operates within a spiritual economy that has its own dates, its own points of greater intensity, its own thresholds, where what is offered carries a reach that at other moments it would not. Why the anniversary of death, and not just any other day? Saint Teresa of Jesus answered this indirectly but consistently throughout her writings. The day a soul crossed the threshold of eternity is the day its history changed irreversibly. It is the day it was presented before God exactly as it was. It is the day the process began that is carrying it through purification toward the fullness for which it was created. That day holds a weight in that soul's history that no other day holds. And that weight creates a special opening, a particular receptivity, on each of its anniversaries. Consider it this way. The Church celebrates the sacraments at precise moments because she understands that time can be sacred, that certain instants carry a spiritual density others do not. Baptism is not celebrated at just any point in a person's life. It happens at the moment the soul enters the life of grace. The sacraments have their moment because grace respects time, even though it is not limited by it. Saint Teresa of Ávila applied a similar understanding to prayer for the departed. The anniversary of death is the natural sacrament of memory, the moment when the love of the living can act most effectively on the waiting soul, because it is the moment when that soul's history holds an openness that exists at no other point in the year. What Saint Teresa of Jesus recommended for that day had a concreteness that stands out. She did not speak of vague feelings or imprecise devotions. She spoke of specific acts with a specific intention directed toward a specific person. A Mass offered for that departed loved one on the day of their anniversary. Not a general Mass for all the departed, but one requested with that person's name, with the intention that the Eucharistic grace reach that soul on that day. Saint Teresa of Ávila believed and wrote that the efficacy of that Mass on the anniversary was qualitatively different from the efficacy of the same Mass offered on any other day of the year. The Rosary prayed on the anniversary with the intention directed to that specific person, almsgiving done in their name, fasting offered for their soul, a visit to the cemetery, not as a ritual of human memory, but as a conscious act of spiritual love. Saint Teresa of Ávila never separated the outward gesture from the interior intention that gave it meaning, and what she taught about sufferings on the anniversary always carried that double dimension: the concrete act and the conscious intention that turns it into something more than a pious habit. There is something Saint Teresa of Jesus added about what happens in the soul when it receives that grace on the day of its anniversary. She described the effect not as something gradual and imperceptible, but as something the soul experiences in a real way. Something that produces what Saint Teresa of Ávila called in the way of perfection and advancement. A step forward on the road, not to the end of the journey, but within it. The grace received on the anniversary moves the soul in a way that grace received on other days also moves it, but with a force that on that particular day carries a greater intensity. This makes the anniversary one of the most real and concrete opportunities the living have to do something genuinely useful for their departed, something that arrives, that acts on their process, that shortens their wait, that brings them closer to God in a way that without that intervention would have taken longer. Saint Teresa of Jesus called this one of the purest acts of love a living person can perform, because it is a love that expects nothing in return in this life. A love that gives without receiving any visible confirmation that it arrived. A love that acts in faith. And there is something Saint Teresa of Ávila did herself for her own departed that illustrates all of this better than any explanation. Something her biographers recorded, and that shows how she lived what she taught. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not write about the departed from the distance of someone theorizing about something she had not personally lived. What she wrote about souls in purification, about prayer for the dead, about the efficacy of sufferings and the reality of the bond that persists between the living and those who have crossed the threshold. All of it was born from an experience her confessors documented carefully, and which the Church took seriously from the beginning. Saint Teresa of Ávila had been in contact with souls in purgatory in a way she herself described with a mixture of sobriety and gratitude, as though those visions did not belong to her, but had been entrusted to her so that others might know what she had seen. There is one episode in particular that appears in the book of her life, and that her biographers have cited repeatedly because it captures, in concrete terms, how Saint Teresa of Jesus lived intercession for the departed. A priest who had been her confessor for a time died under circumstances that, to the eyes of the world, could have seemed spiritually worrying. His life had had its shadows, as almost everyone's does. But there was also in him a sincerity of faith that Saint Teresa of Ávila knew from the inside, through the closeness that spiritual direction creates. When he died, she began praying for him with an intensity that surprised even her sisters in the convent. Not formal prayers, not the rosary said out of habit. A sustained daily intercession that brought this priest's name before God with a constancy that did not waver, even when no visible consolation arrived. And then it did arrive, not dramatically, not in a spectacular apparition that could have been confused with the wish of someone wanting to see what was not yet there. It arrived in prayer, with that interior clarity that Saint Teresa of Ávila had learned to distinguish precisely from her own projections, as a certainty that the soul of that priest had advanced, that what she had offered had arrived and had acted, that the love with which she had prayed had not been lost in the void, but had found its destination. Saint Teresa of Jesus founded her convents with a clear awareness that prayer for the departed was one of the central reasons for their existence. In the book of her foundations, she wrote it with a directness that left no room for interpretation. The discalced Carmelites existed in part to intercede for the souls the world forgot, to pray for those who no longer had anyone on earth to remember them before God, to be the presence of love those souls needed the presence that the distraction of the world prevented from arriving in a steady, sustained way. Every convent Saint Teresa of Ávila founded was also, in her understanding, a home of intercession for the dead. What this reveals is not simply the devotion of a saint. It reveals a theological conviction that Saint Teresa of Jesus had built on the foundation of what she had seen and what the Catholic faith teaches. The conviction that the living and the dead are not separated by a final silence, but connected by a love that persists and by prayer that acts as a bridge between two dimensions of existence. That what a living person does or fails to do for their departed loved one has real consequences for that person's journey. That indifference is not neutral, that forgetting is not innocent, and that active love that takes the form of a mass requested, a rosary prayed, alms given with a name and an intention, is one of the purest forms of love that exists because it expects nothing back in this life. On the anniversary of a loved one's death, all of that understanding finds its point of greatest relevance, because it is the day when the soul is most receptive, when grace holds a special opening, when the bond between the living and the departed reaches its point of greatest intensity in the whole year. It is the day when Saint Teresa of Jesus would have said, "If you are going to do something for this person, do it today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you have more time or more energy. Today, on this day that will not return for another year." There is one last thing Saint Teresa of Ávila described about what happens when the love of the living and the receptivity of the soul meet on the anniversary with the intensity we have walked through together. One thing that closes the full circle of what happens to your loved one's soul on that day. And it changes not only the way you understand your departed, it changes the way you understand yourself in relation to them. There is an image Saint Teresa of Jesus used in the interior castle that her readers have cited for centuries because it has the rare ability to say in a few words what would take pages to explain any other way. She spoke of the soul on its journey toward God as a person moving along a road in darkness, carrying a small light. The light does not illuminate the entire road, only the next step. But that is enough to keep moving forward. And when someone from outside adds more light, the soul can see farther, can move with greater confidence, can travel in less time what would have taken far longer without that additional light. That additional light is what the prayer of the living does for the soul in purification. And on the anniversary of death, that light arrives with an intensity no other day of the year can match. But there is something more in that image, something Saint Teresa of Ávila did not explain explicitly, but that is implicit in everything she wrote about the relationship between the living and the dead. When the soul receives that additional light on the day of its anniversary, when the grace of prayer offered with intention arrives at the moment of greatest receptivity in the year, what happens is not only that the soul advances, it is that the soul recognizes where that light is coming from. It recognizes the love that produces it. It recognizes the living person who is offering it. And in that recognition, something occurs that Saint Teresa of Jesus described in the book of her life with a tenderness that is difficult to read without feeling something. The soul responds. From where it is, with what it has, with the purified love that has now become its deepest nature, the soul turns toward the one who remembers it and prays for it, not as someone returning a favor, as someone who loves, with the freedom and force of a love that no longer has any of the limitations that accompanied it here. A love that on earth was mixed with fear, with need, with dependence, with all the dark undertones that human life adds even to the most beautiful bonds. A love that is now clean, that arrives, that acts on the living in ways the living cannot always identify, but that Saint Teresa of Ávila believed were completely real. This is what happens to your loved one's soul on the anniversary of their death. This is what Saint Teresa of Jesus saw and described with the precision of someone who has been where we have not yet been. On that day, the soul recognizes the moment of its greatest transformation. It sees its journey with renewed clarity. It experiences the burning gratitude of one who understands the magnitude of the grace that sustains it. It perceives the love of those who remember it from the side of the living. It receives the grace of the sufferings offered with intention on that day, with a receptivity that exists in no other way at any other moment of the year. And from where it is, with everything purification has given it up to that point, it loves back, with a force that death could not interrupt, but in a way only faith can fully grasp, made purer. The anniversary is not the day when the living remember the dead alone. It is the day when the living and the waiting soul meet with the greatest closeness that exists on this side of eternity. It is the point where the love that united them in life proves that death did not break it, that it is still acting, that it has direction and force and the capacity to shorten the distance death placed between them. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived with this conviction throughout her entire adult life. She prayed it, she wrote it, she built it into stone and monastic rule. She entrusted it to the sisters who followed her and the confessors who guided her and the readers who for centuries have found in her pages something no other spiritual text had given them in quite the same way. And what she wanted us to understand was not a theory about the afterlife. It was a practical truth about what we can do here from the side of the living, for those we love who are waiting on the other side. The anniversary of your loved one's death is an opportunity, the greatest opportunity of the year to do something real for that person, not something symbolic, not something that mainly consoles you while they wait and receive nothing, something that arrives, that acts, that moves them toward God, a mass offered with their name, a rosary prayed with their face in your heart, a work of charity done in their memory with the intention that the grace of that act benefit their soul. Small things in appearance, with a real weight in the spiritual economy that Saint Teresa of Ávila understood more deeply than almost any other spiritual teacher of her time. And when you do that, when on the next anniversary of your loved one's death, you offer something concrete with that intention, remember what Saint Teresa of Jesus saw, that on the other side there is a soul that perceives it, that receives it, that advances because of it, and that loves you back with a love that death could not interrupt, but that in some sense only faith can fully understand, made it more pure. You made it to the end, and that says something about you that perhaps you haven't noticed yet. In a world that avoids the question of those who are no longer here, that would rather change the subject when someone mentions a departed loved one because it doesn't know what to say, that has turned grief into something that must be resolved quickly and quietly so as not to inconvenience anyone, you chose to stay. You chose to listen. You chose to give your loved one what very few living people give: your attention, your heart, and the time it takes to understand what is really happening with them on that day that returns each year with the same weight. And what you received today is not easy comfort. It is not a softened version of an uncomfortable truth. It is the whole truth, the one Saint Teresa of Jesus saw with her own spiritual eyes and left written so that it would travel through the centuries and arrive here, in this moment, to you. Today you learned that the anniversary of your loved one's death is not just a date on the calendar of the living. It is a real spiritual event that takes place on both sides of the veil at the same time. You learned that the soul of your departed is not asleep or absent or cut off from what happens on earth. It is awake, lucid, with an awareness that surpasses everything it knew in life, moving along a road that leads toward God with a clarity about its own process that none of us here has about ours. You learned that on the anniversary of their death, the soul recognizes the moment of its greatest transformation. that it contemplates the road traveled since it departed with a gratitude Saint Teresa of Ávila compared to a flame that illuminates without consuming, that it perceives those who remember it from the side of the living with an awareness that on that day reaches its highest point in the whole year, that it receives the sufferings offered with intention on that date with a receptivity that exists in no other way at any other moment. And you learned that from where it is, with the purified love that purification has restored to its cleanest form, the soul loves you back. It brings you before God. It intercedes for you with the force of one who no longer has any of the limitations that here accompany even the most genuine love. That the anniversary is not the day when the living remember alone. It is the day when the living and the waiting soul meet with the greatest closeness that exists between the two dimensions of existence. That is what Saint Teresa of Jesus saw. That is what you have taken with you today. And now that you know it, the next anniversary of your loved one's death cannot be the same. Not because you need to do something complicated or because faith requires grand gestures, but because you now understand what is at stake on that day, what the soul is waiting for, what it can receive, what your love, when expressed consciously and intentionally on that date, can do for someone who is on the other side of the veil, waiting for exactly that. A mass offered with their name, a rosary prayed with their face in your heart, a work of charity done in their memory with the intention that that grace reach their soul. Small things in appearance, with a weight that Saint Teresa of Ávila understood better than almost anyone, and to which she devoted her entire life to communicating with as much clarity as possible. That is the gift you take with you today, not an emotion that fades when you close this video. An understanding that changes something in the way you live, the bond with your departed from this day forward. But there is one more thing I want to say before this moment closes. Because what you've just received should not stay with you alone. Think for a moment about the people you know who are also carrying a departed loved one in their heart, who also face that date each year with the same weight, the same silence, that sense that the love they feel does not know quite where to go, because no one has ever explained to them that it has a real and concrete destination. People who pray for their departed out of habit, without understanding the difference it makes to pray with intention on the exact day of the anniversary. People who may have stopped praying for them a long time ago, without realizing what that means from the other side of the veil. Those people need what you just received here. And you can be the one who brings it to them. You don't have to explain every detail. You don't have to remember every word you heard. Just share this with them. Just say, listen to this. There is something here that has to do with your loved one, with what happens to them on the anniversary of their death. And I think you need to hear it. That gesture, small as it appears, could be for someone you know exactly what it was for you to arrive here today. Because the communion of saints that Saint Teresa of Jesus lived with such intensity does not operate only between the living and the dead. It operates among the living too. In the way we pass on to one another the truths the world would rather ignore. In the way the love we receive becomes the love we give. In the way an understanding that reaches one heart can travel through that heart to 10 more. There is something Saint Teresa of Ávila repeated in different ways throughout her entire body of work, and that summarizes everything we have walked through today better than anything else I could offer you at the end. She repeated it in the interior castle, in the way of perfection, in the book of her life. She lived it in every foundation, in every prayer for her departed, in every mass she requested with a specific soul's name on her lips. And it is this, that the love that does not stop at death is the love that most resembles the love of God. Because God does not stop loving for any reason, not for time, not for silence, not for the veil that separates what we see from what we cannot yet see. The love you feel for your departed loved one is not an emotion that was left without a destination when they died. It is a real force with a place to go, with a way to arrive, with the capacity to do something concrete for someone who is waiting for it on the other side, with a receptivity that on the anniversary of their death reaches its highest point in the entire year. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that. She saw it. She left it written so that you would know it today. And now you do. That changes everything. There are more truths about what passes between the living and the dead, about what souls experience on the road that leads them toward God, about what the Catholic faith preserves in the writings of its saints and in the depth of its doctrine, waiting in this same space. Truths that Saint Teresa of Jesus recorded and that very few have ever had the opportunity to hear, explained with the clarity and closeness they deserve. If what you received today moved you, if it shifted something in the way you understand your departed, or in the way you will live the next anniversary of their death, then what comes next in this space is also for you. You don't need to go looking for it. Let it come to you. It will be here, waiting whenever you need it. May God bless the name you are carrying in your heart. May divine mercy reach their soul in all its fullness. May the love that unites you remain the bridge Saint Teresa of Ávila described with such beauty, a bridge that death could not sever, but that in the providence of God has become more real, more clean, and more eternal than it ever was when you were both here together. Until next time.